There's a pillar of salt standing somewhere on the western shore of the Dead Sea. According to legend, it's the remains of a woman who made one fatal choice. She looked back at the city she loved as it burned. Her name was never recorded, but her mistake echoes through 4,000 years of human history. The city she couldn't abandon was Sodom, not the caricature you learned about in Sunday school, but a Bronze Age tech hub, wealthy, sophisticated, powerful. It controlled the bitumen trade, the sealant that held the ancient world together. Its walls were 20 feet thick. Its markets overflowed with silks and spices and silver. From a distance, when the setting sun hit its limestone walls, the entire city glowed like hammered gold. And then, one morning, the sky tore open, and Sodom became the most famous mass grave in history. This is the story of what really happened in the Jordan Valley 4 millennia ago. The geology, the archaeology, the slow seduction of a righteous man named Lot, who pitched his tent toward prosperity and lost everything that mattered. It's a story about golden cages and the terrible price of looking back. So settle in, turn off the distractions, because this isn't just ancient history, this is a mirror. There are moments in history when a man stands at a crossroads and the choice he makes echoes for millennia. This is the story of one such moment, a story of prosperity and ruin, of a garden that became a furnace, and of a single glance backward that turned flesh into salt. In the high country of Canaan, 2 men stood on the ridge of Bethel, looking down at the world spread before them like an offering. Abraham, the patriarch, weathered and patient. Lot, his nephew, younger, ambitious, hungry for the future. Between them stretched the Jordan Valley, a ribbon of green so lush it seemed almost obscene in the surrounding desert. The air was thick with moisture here, carrying the scent of wild fig and tamarisk. Below them, the river coiled through the plain like a serpent of silver, and at the far end of that serpent lay the 5 cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela. From this distance, they looked like jewels scattered on green velvet. The flocks had grown too large. The land couldn't support them both anymore. It was time to divide. Abraham, ever the gentleman, gave his nephew first choice. "Is not the whole land before you?" he said. "If you take the left, I will go to the right. If you take the right, I will go to the left." Simple, clean, the offer of an older man who had already learned that grasping brings nothing but thorns. But Lot lifted his eyes and saw something Abraham had learned not to see. He saw water. He saw grass that stayed green even in summer. He saw cities with walls and gates, markets and industry. The Jordan plain was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt itself. And in Lot's mind, a calculation began, a quiet, rational whisper that prosperity was not just a blessing, but a sign. Surely God favored those who thrived. Surely success meant approval. What he didn't calculate was this. The Jordan Valley in the 21st century before Christ was not the arid trench we know today. It was a subtropical delta fed by aquifers and seasonal floods, a place where date palms grew 40 feet tall and orchards produced 2 harvests a year. Water rights in this region were worth more than gold. And Lot, the herdsman, knew it. He chose the whole plain of Jordan and moved his tents eastward. The text says he pitched his tent as far as Sodom. But that phrase, "as far as," carries a movement. It wasn't a destination. It was a trajectory. He didn't move into the city, not yet. He moved toward it. And that first step toward the shadow is always the easiest to justify. The wealth of Sodom didn't come from agriculture alone. It came from the earth itself, from the thick black seepages that bubbled up around the Dead Sea like wounds that wouldn't heal. The ancients called them the slime pits, but we know them as asphalt deposits, bitumen fields, natural petroleum reserves that oozed to the surface in sticky, sulfurous pools. The smell was unmistakable, a mix of tar and rotten eggs, the scent of deep earth forced into daylight. And for the Bronze Age world, this was liquid gold. Bitumen was the sealant that made ships watertight, the mortar that held defensive walls together, the glue of empire. Egypt used it to embalm their dead. Babylon used it to waterproof their ziggurats, and Sodom controlled the supply. Caravans came from Mesopotamia, from the coast of Phoenicia, from the highlands of Anatolia, all seeking the black tar that made civilization possible. The cities of the plain weren't just prosperous. They were a tech hub, an ancient Silicon Valley built on a single, irreplaceable resource. Lot walked through the markets and smelled jasmine mixed with bitumen. He heard the ring of silver on merchant scales. He saw fabrics dyed with colors he couldn't name, jewelry worked with techniques he'd never seen, and beneath his feet, so subtle he almost didn't notice it, the ground hummed. A low-frequency vibration, like the earth was breathing. The Dead Sea sits on a fault line, the same geological rift that runs from Syria to Mozambique. And in those days, the pressure was building. The earth was restless. But who pays attention to omens when the market is booming? Lot didn't stay in his tent. That's the detail that tells you everything. He moved from a tent, mobile, temporary, the dwelling of a man passing through, to a house with a gate. This wasn't just an upgrade in comfort. It was a change in identity. A tent says, I'm a pilgrim. A house with a gate says, I'm a citizen. I belong here. The archaeology doesn't lie. At Tall El Hammam, just northeast of the Dead Sea, they found massive fortifications, walls 20 feet thick, gates with multiple chambers, towers that would have required thousands of laborers to construct. This wasn't a village, it was a fortress city, a place where wealth was guarded and status was measured in stone. Lot acquired property here. He built. He settled. And at night, he heard the sounds of the city, the music, the laughter, the revelry that went long past midnight and well into the hours when honest men should be sleeping. At first it troubled him. The text says he was vexed in his righteous soul day after day. But here's the thing about vexation. It fades. The human ear adjusts to noise. The human conscience adjusts to compromise. What shocks you on Monday becomes normal by Friday. Lot began to lose the ability to distinguish vice from culture, cruelty from sophistication. The city called it progress. Lot called it civilization. And when they appointed him a judge at the gate, a position of honor, of influence, he accepted. He was part of the system now, not just a resident, an official, a man with a voice in the councils of power. And that voice, day by day, grew quieter on the things that mattered. The 5 cities weren't isolated outposts. They were a network, a confederation of trade and vice and mutual prosperity. Gomorrah specialized in textiles, Admah dealt in livestock, Zeboim controlled the northern trade routes. Bela, later called Zoar, was the smallest, a way station for travelers. And Sodom was the crown jewel, the hub where all roads met. Walk through that marketplace in your mind. Hear the haggling in a dozen languages. Smell roasted lamb and coriander. The tang of fermented wine. The heavy perfume oil that merchants used to mask the scent of bitumen that clung to everything. See the stalls piled with figs and pomegranates, with bolts of linen and bronze daggers, with idols carved from olive wood and painted with ochre. And watch, really watch, the way people move, the confident stride of the wealthy, the hurried shuffle of the poor, the careful eyes-down walk of the stranger, because in Sodom there was a hierarchy that everyone understood. The locals were protected, the merchants were tolerated, but the stranger, the foreigner, the poor traveler who came seeking shelter, they were sport. The prophet Ezekiel would later define the sin of Sodom this way: pride, fullness of bread, and an abundance of idleness. They had so much, they invented cruelty as entertainment. They turned exploitation into culture, and the marketplace, with all its color and wealth, was built on the backs of those who had no voice and no protection. A traveler enters the square, dusty, tired, looking for water. Watch what happens. The crowd doesn't ignore him. They notice. They circle. Someone bumps him. Someone else laughs. His coin purse is lighter when he leaves than when he arrived. And if he complains, the judges at the gate shrug. You should have been more careful, stranger. The city's pulse quickens during these moments, not with shame, with pleasure. And Lot, sitting at that gate, saw it, day after day, and said nothing. Abraham built altars, simple ones, rough stones piled in the open air, places to call on the name of the Lord under the sky. No priests, no rituals, no hierarchy, just a man and his God, and the smoke of a sacrifice rising into the wind. You can still find those kinds of altars in the highlands of Judea, cairns of limestone, weathered and nameless, marking places where someone once cried out to heaven. But in the cities of the plain, the altars were different. They were enclosed, ornate, dark. The temples smelled of incense and animal musk and something else, something sour like fear. The gods here demanded more than worship. They demanded participation, ritual prostitution, child sacrifice in times of crisis. The priests wore gold, and the gold was bought with blood. Lot's daughters began to wear jewelry that reflected the local style, crescent moons, serpents, the symbols of Ishtar and Moloch. His wife attended the banquets at the temple. It wasn't apostasy, she said. It was culture. It was being a good neighbor. And Lot, the man who once walked with Abraham, said nothing, because by now his voice had grown too small to be heard over the sound of his own comfort. Then the heat came, not the normal heat of summer, but something else, an unnatural warmth that settled over the valley like a blanket made of iron. The air shimmered. The animals grew restless. At night, the stars seemed closer, brighter, almost angry. The water levels in the Dead Sea began to drop, exposing white crusts of salt along the shoreline. The old shepherds in the hills muttered about signs and seasons, about the way the earth felt before a storm that had no clouds. But in Sodom, the elite laughed. Omens were for primitives, shepherds who lived in tents and talked to invisible gods. Civilized people didn't fear the weather. They built walls against it. They controlled their environment. They were masters of their fate. Lot stood on the roof of his house one evening and looked toward the mountains where Abraham still lived. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a cold finger of dread tracing down his spine. The horizon looked wrong. The light looked wrong. Everything looked wrong. But when his wife called him down to dinner, he went, because what can one man do against the momentum of an entire civilization? You go along. You survive. You tell yourself that surely, if there was real danger, someone would sound an alarm. And then, on the shimmering horizon to the west, 3 figures appeared, walking slowly, deliberately, toward the tent of Abraham at Mamre. And though Lot didn't see them, some part of him, some buried, suffocated part, knew the reckoning had begun. The great oaks of Mamre were ancient even then, their trunks thick as houses, their branches spreading like the canopy of heaven itself. It was the heat of the day, that dead hour after noon, when even the insects fall silent and the air itself seems to hold its breath. Abraham sat in the shade of his tent door, an old man now, his beard white as wool, his eyes still sharp despite the years. And then he saw them, 3 men standing there as if they had simply materialized from the heat shimmer. He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't ask their names. He ran to them, ran, despite his age, despite the heat, and bowed himself to the ground. "My lords," he said, "if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." This is the ancient law of hospitality, the code that governed the desert and the highland both. A stranger at your tent door is not an inconvenience. He is a test. He is sacred. You bring water for his feet. You bring bread and meat. You give the best you have, not the leftovers, and you ask nothing in return. Abraham commanded his household like a general: water, cakes of fine flour, a calf tender and good. Sarah, despite her age, despite her skepticism, baked bread with her own hands. The finest butter, the freshest milk. He stood by them under the tree while they ate, and he served them himself. Because some guests, you sense, carry eternity in their pockets. They asked about Sarah, and then one of them, the one whose voice carried a weight that made the leaves stop rustling, spoke a promise so absurd it made an old woman laugh behind the tent door. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah laughed, not with joy, with bitterness, with the tired cynicism of a woman whose body had betrayed her dreams decades ago. The visitor heard. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked. And Sarah, suddenly afraid, lied. "I did not laugh." The voice came back, quiet and terrible. "No, but you did laugh." And here is where the curtain tears. The visitor turned towards Sodom, and the atmosphere changed. The promise of life gave way to the necessity of death. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," he said. "Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." Abraham understood. The three were leaving. Two of them, anyway, and the place they were going was the place where his nephew lived, where Lot's wife and daughters slept at night behind walls that would not hold. And Abraham, the friend of God, did something extraordinary. He started to negotiate. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? 50 righteous people," he said. "Would you destroy the city if there are 50 righteous people in it?" The answer came back, "For 50, I will spare the whole place." Abraham pressed, 45, 40, 30, 20. Each time the same answer, "For the sake of that many, I will not destroy it." And then Abraham, his voice growing smaller, asked the final question. 10. "What if there are 10? For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." 10 righteous people in an entire city, not 10 perfect people. Just 10 who still had a conscience, a moral center, a capacity for shame. 10 people who would stand against the mob, who would protect the stranger, who would say no when the collective said yes. And even that, even 10, was a generous estimate. Because Abraham knew Sodom. He'd seen it from a distance. He'd heard the stories. And the terror in his voice as he bargained wasn't the terror of a man confident in his nephew's city. It was the terror of a man who suspected that 10 might be 9 too many. The Lord departed, and the 2 messengers, angels, though they looked like ordinary men, turned their faces towards Sodom. And Abraham stood there watching them go, knowing he had done all he could, which is to say, knowing it was not enough. The road to Sodom was 14 miles of dust and heat, downhill all the way, descending from the highlands into the deep geological trench of the Dead Sea Basin. The two walked it in silence, their feet stirring small clouds with each step. And as they walked, the world around them changed. The birds stopped singing first, then the insects. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west, died. The air grew thick, oppressive, charged with something that had no name but that every living thing recognized. Shepherds in the hills pulled their flocks closer. Merchants on the road quickened their pace without knowing why. The angels appeared unremarkable. Brown robes, dusty sandals, the weathered skin of men who walked long distances. Nothing about them suggested power or danger, and that was the point. Because this was a test, not of doctrine or belief, but of instinct. Would the city of Sodom, upon seeing 2 vulnerable strangers arriving at dusk, offer them protection? Or would it see them as prey? Lot was sitting in the gate when they arrived. The gate of a city in the ancient Near East wasn't just an entrance. It was the courthouse, the marketplace, the political nerve center. Men of standing sat there to see and be seen, to adjudicate disputes, to conduct business, and Lot had a seat at that gate now, a place of honor. He'd made it. He was somebody. And then he saw them. 2 men, strangers, walking toward the city as the sun touched the western hills. and Lot felt something he hadn't felt in years, a jolt of recognition, a spike of holy fear that cut through all the accumulated comfort and compromise. He didn't know who they were, but he knew what they were, and he knew with absolute certainty that they could not spend the night in the square. He rose and went to them, bowing low. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They refused at first. "No," they said, "we will spend the night in the town square." And Lot pressed them urgently. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. The desperation in his voice said everything. Finally, they turned aside to his house. And Lot, walking quickly, almost running, felt the eyes of the city on his back. Inside he made them a feast, unleavened bread, bread made without yeast, baked in haste, the same bread that would later mark the Passover, the night of blood and deliverance. Lot's wife complained. They had plans. There was a banquet at the magistrate's house. Important people would be there. But Lot, for once, didn't yield. "These men stay. These men eat. These men are under my roof, and under my roof they are safe." His wife relented, but the look on her face was clear. "You're embarrassing us. This isn't how civilized people behave." Outside, the sun descended toward the horizon, and the city of Sodom prepared for evening. The streets began to fill, the torches were lit, the markets closed and the taverns opened. And somewhere in that transition between day and night, a murmur started. Two strangers at Lot's house, young, handsome, unprotected. The sunset that evening was extraordinary, the kind of sunset that painters spend their lives trying to capture and never quite succeed. The western sky turned gold, then amber, then a deep, burning orange. And the light, the horizontal light of the dying sun, hit the limestone walls of Sodom and transformed them. For 20 minutes the whole city glowed as if it were made of hammered gold, beautiful, radiant, a lie told in light. Lot stood at his window and watched it, and for a moment, just a moment, he remembered his first day in this valley. He'd been younger then, eager, full of hope. He'd looked at this city and seen opportunity, prosperity, the future. He'd pitched his tent towards Sodom, and then he'd moved into Sodom, and then he'd become Sodom. And now, standing in his fine house with his fine robes and his position at the gate, he felt something he couldn't name. Not quite regret, not quite grief, more like the phantom pain of an amputation, the ache for something that used to be part of you but isn't anymore. The sky above was wrong, though. Beneath the gold and amber there was a bruised purple, the color of a healing wound, the color of deep water where light doesn't reach. Atmospheric scientists would tell you it's caused by particulates in the upper atmosphere, by dust and ash that scatter light in unusual ways. The ancients would tell you it's the color of heaven holding its breath. Both are true. The first torch was lit in the street below, and then another and another, and the murmur that had started at dusk grew into a rumble, and the rumble grew into voices, and the voices grew into a crowd, and the crowd moved like a single organism toward the house where Lot had taken his guests. Lot heard them coming. He heard the footsteps, the laughter, the low, excited chatter of people about to do something they know is wrong but have convinced themselves is right. And then the knock came. Not gentle, not tentative, the hard, rhythmic pounding of fists and staffs against wood, the sound of a mob that has already made up its mind. Lot looked at the two strangers in his house. They sat calmly, watching him, their faces unreadable. And Lot understood in that moment that this was not a test of them. It was a test of him, of his city, of everything he had built and become. He walked to the door. His hands were shaking. His wife grabbed his arm. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't make a scene. Let them have what they want. It's not worth it." But Lot shook her off. Because some things, even for a compromised man, even for a coward, are worth it. He opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him, alone, facing the city he had called home. and all of Sodom looked back at him with a single, hungry smile. The street was packed. Not just the young men, not just the troublemakers who prowl the edges of civilization looking for chaos. All of them, young and old, merchants and laborers, the men who sat at the gate during the day, dispensing justice, the fathers who blessed their children at night. All of them pressed together in the flickering torchlight, their faces transformed by the alchemy of the mob into something that wasn't quite human anymore. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they called. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Know them. The Hebrew word is yada, to know intimately, carnally. This wasn't curiosity. It was violation as a weapon, rape as dominance, the final assertion of a city's power over anyone who dared to enter without permission. And Lot, standing alone between his door and the mob, felt the full weight of his failure. He had lived among these people for decades. He had done business with them. He had judged their disputes. He had called them neighbors, and now he saw them for what they were, for what they had always been, for what he, perhaps, had become. He raised his hands. "Please, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Brothers. Even now he used that word. Even now he tried to appeal to something that had died long ago. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Silence. For one terrible heartbeat, silence. And then the daughters, listening from inside, heard their father offer them to the mob. Their own father. The man who was supposed to stand between them and the world. And something broke in that house that would never be repaired. A trust, a bond, the invisible architecture that holds a family together. The crowd didn't accept the offer, not because they had standards, but because the offer itself was an insult. "This fellow came in to stay as a foreigner," they shouted, "and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." They surged forward, pressing against Lot, pushing him back against his own door. The smell of them, wine and sweat and torch smoke and something darker, something animal, washed over him. He was going to die here, killed by his neighbors, in front of his own house. And no one would call it murder. They would call it justice. And then the door opened behind him. Hands reached out, strong hands, hands that felt like they were carved from stone, and pulled him inside. The door slammed shut, and through the narrow window a light blazed. Not firelight, not torchlight, something else, something that didn't flicker or fade but burned steady and white and impossibly bright. The mob screamed, not in anger, in pain, in terror. The light struck them like a physical blow, and they clutched at their faces, stumbling backward, falling over each other in their haste to escape something they couldn't see, because seeing was suddenly beyond them. They were blind, not in darkness, that would have been a mercy. They were blind in light. Their eyes were open but saw nothing, their pupils seared by a brilliance that wasn't meant for human vision. Medical science has a term for this. Photokeratitis, flash burn to the cornea. It's what happens when you stare at an arc welder or at the sun during an eclipse. The pain is immediate and absolute, a sensation like sand rubbed into your eyes mixed with the deep ache of tissue damage. And these men felt it all at once, all of them, as if they had stared directly into the birth of stars. But here is the horror. They didn't leave. Even blind, even stumbling, even weeping from the pain, they continued to grope for the door. Their hands scratched at the wood, feeling for the latch, the hinges, any weakness they could exploit. Because the mob, once formed, doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have reason. It has only appetite. And these men, even in their blindness, were still hungry. Inside the house, Lot collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The 2 strangers stood over him, and now there was no mistaking what they were. The air around them shimmered. Their voices, when they spoke, carried harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech. "Do you have anyone else here?" they asked. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place." For we are about to destroy it, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Destroy. The word hung in the air like smoke, not reform, not judge, destroy, total, final, the kind of ending that leaves nothing to rebuild from. Lot ran, out into the night, through streets where blind men still wept and cursed, to the houses of his sons-in-law, the young men who had married his daughters, who had mocked his old-fashioned values while enjoying his wealth and position. He pounded on their doors. It was past midnight now, the dead hour when even drunkards have found their beds. The sons-in-law answered, annoyed, sleep-heavy. "Up!" Lot cried. "Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." They stared at him, his hair wild, his eyes wide, the smell of fear pouring off him like perfume. And they laughed. Not cruel laughter. Not yet. Just the tired, patronizing laughter of young men who think their father-in-law has finally lost his mind. "Come now, old man," they said. "You've had a bad dream. Too much wine. Go home. Sleep it off. The city isn't going anywhere." He seemed to them to be jesting. That phrase carries a weight that translation can barely hold. It wasn't that they didn't believe in judgment. It was that they couldn't conceive of judgment happening to them. Here, in this city with its walls and wealth and sophisticated culture, judgment was for primitives, for tent dwellers, for people who hadn't evolved past superstition. And so they closed their doors, and Lot stood in the empty street, and the weight of his own irrelevance crushed him like a stone. He returned home as the first grey light touched the eastern horizon. 3 a.m, the hour of ghosts and decisions. The angels were waiting. "Arise," they said, "take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." Simple, direct. But Lot couldn't move. He stood in his house and looked at his possessions. The fine cedar table from Lebanon, the Egyptian linen, the silver cups he had used to toast success and seal contracts, the jewelry his wife wore to the temple banquets, the idols, small ones, tasteful ones, that his daughters kept in their rooms because everyone had them, and it didn't mean anything, not really. Each object carried a memory, a story, a piece of the life he had built. And now these strangers were telling him to walk away, to leave it all, to become a refugee again, a nomad, a man without a city. His wife was weeping, not from fear of destruction, but from the thought of loss. "We can't leave all this," she said. "We've worked so hard. We've earned this." And Lot, standing in his fine house wearing his fine robes, felt paralyzed, because the golden cage, once you've lived in it long enough, stops feeling like a cage. It feels like home, and the door standing open looks less like freedom and more like suicide. The angels didn't argue. They didn't give him time to think. They reached out and seized him by the hand, seized his wife by the hand, seized his daughters by the hand, and pulled. And the sensation was like being grabbed by machinery, by iron wrapped in flesh. There was no gentleness in it, no concern for comfort. It was pure force, pure necessity. The text says, "the Lord being merciful unto him." And this is what mercy looks like sometimes. Not soft words and patient waiting, but holy violence. Being dragged from the burning house because you've lost the capacity to run. They pulled the family through the streets, past the houses where blind men still wept, past the temple where the priests slept unaware, past the gates that had seemed so strong and were about to become dust. And at the edge of the city, at the boundary between Sodom and the rest of creation, they set them down. "Escape for your life," the angels commanded. "Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." The hills, the mountains, the rough, poor country where Abraham still lived in his tent. Lot looked at those mountains, dark against the graying sky, and felt a cold fist close around his heart. He couldn't do it. After years of civilization, of comfort, of status, he couldn't go back to being nobody. "Oh no, my lords," he said, his voice breaking. "You have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." Zoar, the smallest of the 5 cities, still part of the valley, still part of the system, just smaller. Safer, he told himself, more reasonable. Lot, the coward, the compromiser, negotiating even at the threshold of apocalypse, and the angel, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of exhaustion, agreed. "Behold, I grant you this favor also. I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive." So they ran, Lot and his wife and his daughters, stumbling through the grey pre-dawn toward the small city on the plain. The air had changed. It felt thick now, heavy, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. A humming began, low, subsonic, felt more than heard. The animals sensed it first. Dogs began to howl in the valley. Birds took flight in confused, panicked flocks. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Behind them, in Sodom, the first citizens were waking, bakers firing their ovens, merchants preparing their stalls, guards changing shifts at the gate. The blind men from the night before were being tended by physicians who couldn't explain what had happened. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. The sun was about to rise, just another day in the greatest city of the Jordan Plain. And Lot ran, his lungs burning, his legs weak from years of soft living, toward a city called Zoar. The sun touched the eastern horizon. Light spilled across the valley like gold poured from heaven. Beautiful, radiant, the last sunrise Sodom would ever see. The sky tore open. That's the only way to describe what happened at dawn on that morning 4,000 years ago. The people of Sodom, waking to what they thought would be another ordinary day, looked up and saw the heavens split. A brightness appeared in the upper atmosphere, not the gradual glow of sunrise, but a sudden searing white that made the sun itself look dim. A fireball, larger than the moon, screaming toward Earth at 17 miles per second. Modern science calls it a meteoric airburst, a chunk of rock and ice from the asteroid belt, perhaps 500 feet across, entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speed. The friction generates heat, not gradually, but instantly. Thousands of degrees, the surface of the meteor vaporizes, creating a plasma sheath that glows brighter than any star. And then, at an altitude of about 2 miles above the Jordan Plain, the internal pressure becomes too great. The meteor explodes. 10 megatons, the equivalent of 600 Hiroshima bombs, detonating simultaneously in mid-air. The shockwave spreads outward at supersonic speed, a wall of compressed air that flattens everything in its path. But before the shockwave comes, the light. A thermal pulse so intense it flash burns everything within line of sight. Stone doesn't just heat, it melts. Sand doesn't just warm, it fuses into glass. In Sodom, the baker reaching for his oven never completed the motion. The merchant unrolling his awning never saw it unfurl. The mother nursing her infant had no time to scream. The light hit them first, a brightness that seared through closed eyelids, that turned skin to char in the fraction of a second it takes for a synapse to fire. And then the heat. The air itself became fire. Temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Flesh vaporized. Bone turned to powder. The beautiful limestone walls, still glowing gold in the first rays of dawn, liquefied like wax. The people of Sodom didn't have time to understand what was happening. They didn't have time to pray or curse or run. One moment they existed. The next, they were vapor and shadow and ash. 60,000 people, gone between one heartbeat and the next. Entire generations erased in the time it takes to blink. But the fire from above was only the beginning. Beneath Sodom, beneath the entire Jordan plain, lay those vast deposits of bitumen, the black gold that had made the 5 cities rich. Miles of subterranean petroleum, trapped in porous limestone, pressurized by geological forces, waiting. The thermal pulse from the airburst superheated the surface layers. The shock wave that followed fractured the bedrock, and the bitumen ignited. Fire came from below. Geysers of burning petroleum erupted from the slime pits. The ground itself split open, vomiting flame like the mouth of a dragon. The smell, God, the smell, sulfur and burning oil and superheated rock, a stench so acrid it would scorch the lungs of anyone who breathed it. Brimstone, the ancient texts called it. Burning sulfur, the signature scent of judgment. The cities burned from both directions. Fire rained from above, fire erupted from below, and in between, caught in a vice of flame, Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim became hell on earth. The heat was so intense that the sand of the plain fused into trinitite, the same glassy substance found at nuclear test sites where temperatures exceed those of the sun's surface. You can still find it today, scattered across the gore, little green-tinted fragments of glass that shouldn't exist naturally but do. The sound was beyond description. The meteor's explosion was a bass note that shook the earth like a drum. The igniting bitumen was a roar like 1,000 locomotives. The collapsing buildings were a percussion of stone and timber and human achievement falling into ruin. And beneath it all, woven through it, a high keening, the sound of air being sucked into the inferno, the scream of oxygen molecules being ripped apart and consumed. And then, for just a moment, silence. A vacuum of sound as the fire burned so hot it consumed everything, even the air itself. People caught in that zone died not from burns, but from asphyxiation, their lungs collapsing as the oxygen was stripped from their blood. The scream that tried to form in their throats died stillborn, cut short by physics and chemistry and the mathematics of combustion. Lot heard it. Miles away, stumbling towards Zoar with his wife and daughters, he heard the sound like a freight train made of thunder. He felt the ground shake beneath his feet. He felt the heat on his back, growing, intensifying, like standing too close to a forge. And he ran faster, his terror giving him strength his soft life had long ago stolen. His wife ran beside him. Her jewelry clinked as she moved, the gold earrings she'd bought in the marketplace, the silver bracelets from the temple festivals, the ornaments that marked her as a woman of status in a city that was currently being unmade. And as she ran, something pulled at her, not a physical force, something deeper, a gravity of the heart. Everything she had ever worked for was behind her, her house, her friends, her position. The life she had crafted and curated and protected, the identity she had built, it was all burning, all dying, all being erased as if it had never existed. And she simply couldn't let it go without one last look. She stopped. Lot felt her hand slip from his, but he didn't look back, couldn't look back. The angel's command was absolute. The daughters kept running, their own terror overriding their mother's hesitation. But Lot's wife stood still in the path, turned her head, and looked. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't disobedience for its own sake. It was love, twisted, toxic, fatal love. She loved the city more than she loved her life. She loved what she had been more than what she might become. And in that moment of looking, she became what she loved. The thermal pulse hadn't dissipated. The air was still superheated, still carrying vaporized minerals, sodium chloride, calcium sulfate, the salts of the Dead Sea Basin thrown into the atmosphere by the violence of the blast. When she turned, when she faced the inferno, she inhaled, and the hypersaline air, thick with minerals, dense with particles, coated her lungs, her skin, her eyes. The moisture in her body acted as a catalyst, crystallizing the salt instantly. She didn't turn into salt like a fairy tale transformation. She was encased in it, a sculpture of sodium and calcium and human regret, standing in the road, her face forever turned toward the city she couldn't abandon. The heat and the salt and the chemistry of catastrophe preserved her there. A monument, a warning, a woman who chose her cage even when the door was open. Lot felt her absence but didn't stop, couldn't stop. He reached Zoar as the sun cleared the horizon, and he and his daughters fell through the gates, gasping, weeping, alive. Miles away, on the heights of Hebron, Abraham rose early. He had slept poorly, if at all. His conversation with the Lord haunted him, the bargaining, the desperate arithmetic of mercy. 10, righteous. Surely there were 10. Surely. He walked to the place where he had stood before the Lord, the place where he had made his final appeal, and he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, toward the cities of the plain where his nephew lived. What he saw stopped his breath. Smoke, a column of it rising from the valley like the smoke of a furnace. Black and grey and shot through with red, it climbed into the sky in a pillar so vast it seemed to hold up heaven itself. The inversion layer, the atmospheric phenomenon where warm air traps cooler air beneath it, caught the smoke and held it. The entire Dead Sea basin became a bowl of ash and fume, a vision of the pit that no human eye should ever witness. Abraham stood there for a long time. The sun climbed higher, the smoke continued to rise, and the old patriarch, the friend of God, wept. Not because his intercession had failed, though it had, but because he understood in that moment that there hadn't been 10, there hadn't been 5, there had barely been 1, and that one had run for his life, leaving behind a wife who became salt and a city that became ash. The garden of the Lord was gone, the place that had looked like Eden, that had promised prosperity and peace and progress, was erased, and in its place, nothing but smoke and silence and the beginning of a wasteland that would last 4,000 years. The aftermath was surgical in its completeness. When the fires finally burned themselves out, what remained wasn't ruins. Ruins imply structure, recognizable shapes, something that could be rebuilt. This was annihilation. The cities were pulverized to powder. The walls that had stood 20 feet thick were scattered as dust. The houses, the temples, the gates where Lot had sat in judgment, all of it reduced to a layer of white ash that the wind would spend the next 1,000 years spreading across the desert. The Dead Sea itself changed. The thermal event and the seismic activity that followed altered the basin's geology. Water levels shifted. The southern portion of the sea, where the cities had stood, became a shallow brine flat, a place where the salt concentration was so high that nothing could survive. The soil itself was poisoned, not by radiation, but by salt. Sodium chloride, driven deep into the earth by the heat and the shockwave, creating a brine layer that would kill any seed, any root, any attempt at life for centuries to come. Archaeologists have found it. In the layer dating to the Middle Bronze Age, around 1650 BC, there's a destruction horizon, a band of ash and melted material that speaks of temperatures no natural fire could produce. Above it, nothing. No pottery, no walls, no evidence of human habitation. For 700 years, the Jordan Plain south of the Dead Sea was empty. Not because people forgot it existed, but because they remembered what happened there, and the memory kept them away. Lot survived. He made it to Zoar, but he didn't stay. The city he'd begged to reach, the small safe place he thought would be enough, terrified him. He'd seen what happened when divine judgment fell. He'd seen how thin the line was between safety and destruction. So he went to the mountains after all, the place he'd been too afraid to go initially. He and his daughters lived in a cave. A man who had owned a house with a gate now dwelt in stone. A man who had sat in judgment now hid from the sun. His daughters, traumatized and isolated, convinced themselves they were the last people on earth. They committed an act of desperation and incest that would produce two nations, Moab and Ammon, enemies of Israel for generations. The family that had been saved from Sodom carried Sodom inside them. The corruption didn't burn away with the city, it metastasized. And Lot, the righteous man who was saved, barely, reluctantly by force, ended his days as a cautionary tale rather than a hero. The Dead Sea today is the lowest point on Earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. A place where the water is so dense with minerals that the human body floats without effort. Nothing lives in it, no fish, no plants, no microscopic life. It is quite literally dead. And along its shores, in certain places, you can still find the evidence. The ash layer, the trinitite fragments, the sulfur balls, pure sulfur, formed under intense heat and pressure, scattered like hailstones across the ground. And somewhere, according to tradition, encrusted with millennia of salt, standing on the western shore of the Dead Sea, there is a pillar. Lot's wife, geology and legend intertwined, a monument to the woman who looked back. But this isn't ancient history, this is present warning. Because the golden cage exists today, just as it did 4,000 years ago. It's the career that demands your soul in exchange for status. It's the city that offers everything except the one thing that matters. It's the life you've built that looks perfect from the outside and is hollow at the core. It's the comfort that costs you your conscience, the prosperity that purchases your silence, the civilization that baptizes your compromise and calls it sophistication. We build our own Sodoms. We pitch our tents toward them, then we move into them, then we become them. We sit at the gates and judge others while losing the ability to judge ourselves. We accumulate possessions and call it blessing. We accept cruelty as culture. We mistake the absence of immediate judgment for the absence of judgment itself. And when the warning comes, when the angels appear at our door, when the voice calls us to leave, to run, to abandon the burning house, we hesitate, we negotiate, we ask for Zoar, for a smaller compromise, for a gentler transition. We can't imagine life outside the cage, because the cage has become our identity. Judgment is not an act of divine anger, it's a surgery. It's the removal of what refuses to be healed. God doesn't destroy cities because he's offended. He destroys them because they've become a cancer to themselves and to everything around them. And the smoke rises not as a threat, but as a memorial. This is what happens when a society chooses its appetites over its conscience, its comfort over its character, its prosperity over its purpose. The Dead Sea sits there still, a geological scar, a perpetual cellar. Pause and consider. Every year, thousands of tourists float in its buoyant waters, smear its mineral-rich mud on their skin, take selfies against the backdrop of barren mountains. They don't know they're swimming in a mass grave. They don't hear the echoes of the last morning, when the sky fell and the earth burned, and 60,000 people learned, too late, that there are some prices prosperity cannot pay. The wind blows across the salt flats. It whistles through the crystalline formations, through the bones of cities and the monument of a woman who loved the wrong things. And if you listen, really listen, you can hear the voice that has echoed for 4 millennia, the warning that never grows old. Remember Lot's wife.